They said the monastery wept salt instead of blood. Some called it a miracle. Others still hear it praying. At dawn, the air above San Laureano thickened into a pale haze that clung to the mountain like breath. The first light revealed the walls glistening under a thin crust of white, tiny veins that caught the sun and shimmered like frost, yet burned the tongue when tasted. Locals swore the salt had seeped straight from the stone, a secretion of guilt that no rain could wash away. Every morning it returned, crystallizing over the same arches, the same wooden door swollen by humidity, the same cracked bell that hadn't rung since the last monk died 20 years before. They said the sound still moved through the air, inaudible but felt, a low vibration beneath the ribs. When travelers passed near the slope, they claimed their own heartbeat began to echo it, a second pulse dragging behind the first. The villagers no longer climbed up there after sunset. Even in daylight, the path was rarely used. Dust had covered the steps so evenly that the prints of past pilgrims remained fossilized, unbroken, like the place had been holding its breath for decades. Inside the monastery, everything had become coated with the same mineral film. Tables, rosaries, even the iron hinges of the confessional. The wooden pews were warped by moisture, some split open like ribs. Through the long corridor that once led to the chapel, condensation formed every night, dripping into the shape of slow tears along the walls. No one had ever caught it forming. It simply appeared like morning dew that knew its place. But on the third morning of June 1913, the salt came faster. It poured from the walls as if the mountain itself had begun to bleed inward. The texture was wrong, too coarse, too heavy, almost warm. It spread down to the floor, reaching the cracked tiles where a faded line of red still marked the spot where Father Laureano had died. The last monk, the one who refused to leave when the others fled the storm that never ended. A historian named Alvaro Quintero arrived that same day, walking up the path with 2 notebooks, a mercury barometer, and a letter of permission from Bogotá's diocese. He was 38, thin, polite, with a voice that trembled slightly when he asked for water. The villagers watched him climb until he disappeared behind the fog and said nothing. Everyone who went up alone came back, changed, or didn't come back at all. By noon, the light dimmed as though dusk had arrived early. Quintero lit a candle and stepped inside the main hall. The salt cracked beneath his boots. The air smelled metallic, not unlike dried tears, and every sound seemed to recoil before reaching the walls. He wrote that the acoustics were unnatural, an inverted echo, like the sound returns before one speaks. In his notes, later found half dissolved by moisture, he described it as a silence dense enough to refract light. On the altar, he found the crucifix fused to the wall by a sheath of white crystals. The figure's face had vanished, replaced by a mound of mineral veins that ran upward to the ceiling. Behind the altar, a door, sealed with wax, bearing the crest of the Order of St. Aurelius. Its edges were bleeding salt, too. He leaned closer and noticed something strange. The salt grains weren't static. They were shifting, subtly, like 1,000 tiny insects moving in unison. He blinked, thinking it was the flicker of the candle. But when he leaned back, the pattern pulsed again, aligning itself into faint ridges that resembled writing, lines forming, dissolving, returning. The last thing written before the salt collapsed back into dust were 2 words he swore he saw clearly: mea culpa. Outside, the wind changed direction. The fog rose from the valley, filling the archway with a motionless current of cold air. The candle sputtered once, then steadied. Its flame bent toward the door, as if drawn by breath. Quintero wrote only 1 more line that day before the ink refused to dry on his page. It prays without voice, but the walls remember every word. He slept inside the chapel that night. By morning, the salt had reached his boots. When Alvaro Quintero woke, the air inside the chapel felt heavier than before, as though something invisible had settled in the night and decided to stay. The candle beside him had burned down to its stem, leaving a frozen tear of wax stretched mid-fall over the table's edge. Around his bedroll, the salt had risen in faint spirals, curving like the rings of a fingerprint. He ran his hand over the pattern, expecting the grains to scatter, but they clung to his skin, damp, almost alive. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows in slow pulses. He listened. Somewhere beneath the silence, there was rhythm, a faint, recurring hiss like breath through a reed. He thought it might be wind seeping through cracks, but the intervals were too precise. 3 seconds apart, constant. Not wind, not water. A sound that had weight. He stood and crossed the hall, every step leaving a dark print on the salt film. At the far end of the corridor, he found the library, a room he had read about in a letter from Father Urrutia, the monastery's prior before the flood of 1891. The letter mentioned books that never dried, bindings that tasted of salt, pages that wrote themselves again when wiped clean. Quintero thought it superstition then. The door to the library was ajar. Beyond it, the smell of paper rot and humidity struck him hard enough to sting the throat. The shelves were swollen, their wood veined with white crystals that sprouted like coral. Dozens of books lay half open on the floor, their pages curled inward, text fading where the salt had bled through. He crouched and turned one over, its leather binding cracked apart like old skin. Inside, the words were barely legible. Some had bled into one another, but certain phrases reappeared between stains, looping across different books as if repeating themselves. Silence must be confessed. The same line, over and over. He gathered 3 of them and brought them back to the chapel, placing them on the altar to dry. The candlelight revealed faint halos of moisture around each book, and beneath the covers, he thought he heard something. An almost imperceptible crackle, like grains grinding against one another. He held one close to his ear. Nothing, but when he lowered it, the crackle returned, faintly synchronized with the rhythm he'd heard earlier. In his notebook, he wrote, "The salt conducts vibration, possibly the resonance of trapped air, but the pattern suggests intent." He left a second candle burning and stepped outside. The mist had lifted slightly, exposing the slope below. From up there, the valley looked drowned in milk. The villagers' roofs barely showed through, and the river glimmered in fragments of pale light. He exhaled and watched his breath blend into the fog. It didn't drift. It spread outward in concentric ripples, like breath disturbing a still lake. When he turned back toward the building, he froze. On the monastery's exterior wall, where the morning sun had begun to reach, the salt was forming faster than ever. Not a flat crust this time. Columns. Thin, rib-like structures emerging vertically, growing by the second. They twisted and merged, outlining something too symmetrical to be random. From where he stood, the shapes resembled human silhouettes bowed forward, as if in prayer. He moved closer, heart pounding against the quiet. The growth slowed when he approached, but the detail was unmistakable. Spines, shoulders, even the faint indent of folded hands. Each figure perfectly still, yet somehow unfinished, their faces melted into the wall. The air smelled thick, almost sweet, and each inhale burned slightly in his lungs. Quintero reached out, brushing his fingertips against one of the crystalline ridges. The salt was warm, not from the sun, deeper than that, like body heat. He pulled his hand back, and the figure's outline trembled, shedding a faint dust that drifted upward instead of down. He whispered a single word, not out of belief, but instinct. Alive! The echo came back distorted, not from the valley, but from within the wall itself. Live! The syllable hung there, reshaped by stone. He stumbled back, nearly dropping his notebook. The air vibrated again, stronger now. From inside the monastery, the 3 candles flickered simultaneously, their flames bending toward the sealed door behind the altar. The one marked with wax. He felt a pulse under his boots. Once, then again, like something breathing beneath the foundation. The salt along the floor shifted, rearranging itself into circular formations that spread toward the door in perfect alignment. He didn't run, not yet. Instead, he stood still, trying to rationalize what he was seeing. He told himself it was a capillary process, mineral creep under heat and pressure. But he knew no mineral moved in rhythm. He leaned down and traced the outermost circle with his pencil. The vibration stopped instantly, leaving the world silent enough for him to hear his own pulse. And then, very softly, from behind the sealed door, a sound. Not wind, not water, not movement. A voice, hoarse, slow, and perfectly level, reciting in Latin, "Peccavi, I have sinned." He stepped back, shaking, as the candle nearest the altar extinguished without wind. When he looked down, the salt circles had changed again. They now resembled fingerprints. His own. By the afternoon of the same day, Quintero's pulse had begun to sync unconsciously with the rhythm that seemed to rise from the floor itself. Every few minutes he would catch himself breathing in time with it, as though some internal metronome had been hijacked by the monastery's pulse. The air remained unnaturally still, yet objects betrayed movement in minute, incremental ways. The hanging lamp swayed ever so slightly without current. The candle flame bent sideways but never flickered. The pages of his notes wrinkled inward toward their spine, as if inhaling. He decided to break the seal. The wax that sealed the door bore the sigil of Saint Aurelius, two intersecting circles enclosed by a triangle, the edges nearly erased by salt. He heated a knife over the candle's flame and pressed it against the wax. It didn't melt as expected. Instead, it hissed, exuding a faint mist that carried the metallic odor of brine. When he finally forced the blade through, the wax cracked in a single sharp pop, and the pressure behind the door released with a whisper that sounded almost like a sigh. The door opened onto darkness. He lifted his lantern. The light spilled over a staircase, spiraling down into the rock, an inner descent that none of the monastery's original blueprints had ever shown. The air from below was damp, heavy, and smelled faintly of rusted iron and something older, like dried seaweed. The walls were carved directly from limestone, veins of salt glowing faintly where the light touched them. He took a step, then another, counting them aloud. 23 steps before his foot found the floor. At the bottom lay a narrow chamber lined with niches, each containing a ceramic vessel sealed with cloth. He recognized the shape. Reliquaries. Relics from saints long catalogued by the church and locked away from public veneration. But one of the vessels was broken. Its shards lay scattered, their interior smeared with a crystalline residue the same hue as the salt outside, except here it pulsed with a faint phosphorescence. He knelt, shining the lantern closer. The shards trembled as if reacting to the light, and the pulse grew stronger, steady, calm, almost breathing. He reached out to touch it, but the moment his fingers grazed the residue, a vibration traveled up his arm. It wasn't pain, but resonance. His bones humming softly, his teeth clicking together involuntarily. He pulled back and found the same white dust clinging to his skin, reshaping itself into circular ridges like a fingerprint. His again, but mirrored. He looked up. Across the room, etched into the far wall, were words carved directly into stone. Most had eroded away, but enough remained to form a fragment. Ad confessionem perpetuam, to perpetual confession. He understood dimly that the chamber had been meant for containment, not devotion. Something had been sealed here, not to be worshipped, but to be listened to. He moved closer, holding the lantern higher. The flame flickered against moisture, drops of condensation forming spontaneously along the wall. The air began to thrum again, low and deliberate, accompanied by a subtle crackle of crystallization. Salt lines crawled outward from the broken reliquary, expanding over the floor, spreading toward his boots in slow, deliberate veins. Then the voice returned, not through air, but through the material itself, vibrating inside the stone, beneath his feet, through the handle of the lantern. The sound was deep and almost human, syllables drawn out by pressure more than speech. Confiteor Deo, he froze. The Latin confession prayer. But no mouth spoke it. The words seemed to form from within the mineral, as if the salt itself remembered them. Omnipotenti. The rest came fragmented, distorted, stretched between frequencies his ears could not fully register. He covered them with his hands, but the vibration entered his skull through bone. Et tibi, pater. He stumbled back, knocking the lantern to the floor. The glass shattered, flame extinguished instantly, yet the faint phosphorescent residue on the ground continued to glow, illuminating the chamber with a sickly white light. And beneath that light, he saw it. Thin streams of liquid seeping from the carved wall, clear but viscous, running downward into the cracks. Where they touched the floor, they crystallized instantly into salt. He backed toward the stairs, his breathing ragged, the air pressed against his chest like weight. He reached the first step and turned upward, but before he could climb, something brushed against his ankle, a grainy, cool texture moving on its own. He looked down and saw the salt circling his boots, spiraling in the same mirrored pattern of his prints. It wasn't forming new shapes anymore. It was tracing him. He broke free, running up the stairs, every step cracking under the growing crust. When he reached the top, he slammed the door shut and leaned against it, chest heaving. The candlelight in the chapel trembled again, though no wind followed him. His ears rang with silence, the kind that comes after an explosion. He realized then that his right hand was bleeding from small punctures. The salt embedded in his palm glowed faintly before dissolving into sweat. He wrote again, hands shaking. There is sound without air. The confession continues. The salt records. As he looked up from the page, he noticed the books on the altar had changed position. They were open now, their pages fluttering though the air remained still. Each book whispered as if reading itself aloud in a breath too faint to hear. He gathered his things, ready to leave, but then he heard it again, from outside this time. The faint, rhythmic ringing of the monastery bell, the one that hadn't rung in 20 years. One toll, then another. But it wasn't echoing. It was breathing. The bell rang 13 times. Not 12, not 14, 13. Each toll came slower than the last, stretched thin, as if the sound were moving through something viscous instead of air. Quintero stood motionless beneath the archway, watching the vibration crawl across the salt-covered floor in concentric ripples. The bell tower itself was unreachable. Its stairs had long collapsed, but the tone traveled through the stone like liquid thunder, settling in the bones more than the ears. When it finally stopped, the silence that followed was absolute. No echo, no wind, no insects. Even the candlelight refused to move. He stepped outside, notebook under his arm, scanning the fog-drenched courtyard. The air was colder now, and a fine rain of salt dust was falling from the tower like snow. He reached out his hand and caught a few grains. They melted instantly against his skin, leaving a faint mark that burned without heat. Down in the valley, faint and distant, he could see the movement of people, villagers gathering near the church. They were pointing upward, shading their eyes. The monastery was visible again after decades of mist, and its bell had called them. Quintero realized with a slow tightening in his chest that they thought the monastery had returned to life. He turned back toward the interior. The pulse from beneath the floor had not stopped. It had only changed rhythm, faster now, irregular, like something trying to wake. He knelt and placed his palm on the ground. The salt trembled under his touch, forming tiny ridges that aligned perfectly beneath his fingers, as though following his pulse. It was responding to him. He whispered to the empty chapel, half to test the air, half to anchor himself in something human. Who is confessing? The reply came not as sound, but as condensation. On the cold stone before him, droplets formed one by one, aligning into crooked letters. All of us. He recoiled, heartbeat thundering in his throat. The droplets ran together, dissolving the message before his eyes. Behind him, a faint murmur echoed from the altar. Low, rhythmic, almost like the chant of distant monks. But it wasn't coming from any direction he could trace. It was diffused through the air, vibrating within it. He lit another candle and moved cautiously toward the source. The wax seal on the reliquary door had resealed itself. Fresh layers of salt had hardened along its edges, locking it shut again, yet the vibration beneath it continued, steady and deliberate. He touched it lightly. The surface pulsed once, matching his heartbeat, and then fell still. He wrote in his journal again, pattern of resonance identical to cardiac rhythm, possible mineral biomimicry. The salt behaves like a living conductor, but the rational phrasing felt hollow. The handwriting itself began to warp, the ink bleeding outward as if the paper were sweating. He held the pages up to the candlelight. For a fraction of a second, he saw faint words appear beneath his own, lines written in a different hand, older, fainter. Sanctify the silence. Do not answer when it speaks. The letters vanished as quickly as they appeared. He stepped back and realized that every object in the room now bore the same faint humidity. The crucifix, the books, even his own boots. The salt had begun to absorb moisture from the air faster than it could evaporate. The result was a faint, almost imperceptible hiss, as if the entire building were exhaling. Outside, thunder rolled far off over the valley. The sky had turned the color of old iron. He felt the pressure shift in his ears. The storm was climbing the mountain. He extinguished the candle, grabbed his bag, and crossed the courtyard toward the dormitory wing, hoping to find higher ground or an open window for escape. But when he reached the door, he stopped cold. The corridor beyond was no longer empty. Along both sides of the hall stood figures, dozens of them, carved entirely from salt, their surfaces wet with condensation. Monks in robes, heads bowed, hands clasped together in prayer, each one life-sized, their outlines soft and imprecise, as if still forming. The floor beneath them shimmered with a thin film of water, alive with tiny ripples. Quintero stepped closer, lantern trembling in his grasp. He could see their faces now, or what was left of them. The eyes were hollow cavities, the mouths sealed shut. On one of the figures, a drop of water slid down from the temple and fell to the ground, splattering across his boot. The sound of it echoed louder than it should have. He whispered, "Are you what the walls remember?" And from somewhere deep within the hall, a single breath answered. Not a word, not even a sigh, just a drawn-out exhalation, long enough to feel rather than hear. The candle flame bent toward it. One of the figures tilted its head, just slightly. He stumbled backward, slamming into the doorframe. The figure froze again, posture restored, but the air remained disturbed, as though movement had imprinted itself in the space. He held the lantern high, scanning each statue. None moved. Yet the reflection of light in their hollow eye sockets seemed to tremble, alive with moisture. He began to back away when the lantern flickered once more. The walls, ceiling, and floor shimmered in unison. A low hum rose again, not from below this time, but from everywhere at once. Every surface vibrating in harmony, the salt lines glowing faintly blue-white. Then came the voice. Not singular, not plural. A collective resonance rising from stone and air. Confess. The word filled the hall, pressing against his skull like pressure before a storm. He covered his ears, but it was inside him now, vibrating through the blood, not the air. He shouted into the void, "There is no one left to confess." And the walls answered, "Then listen." The vibration ceased. The silence returned, but it was no longer empty. It had texture now, density, like a living thing that waited for his breath to stop before it moved again. He dropped to his knees. The salt was warm beneath his hands. Outside, the bell rang once more, this time on its own, without wind, without echo. And as the tone lingered, he felt it, a faint movement within the statues. Not melting, not breaking, breathing. By nightfall, the monastery had begun to sound alive, not in the way of breathing things, but like an instrument, an architecture of resonance. The walls exhaled faint tones. The beams above creaked not from pressure but from rhythm, as if responding to something subterranean. Each sound had its place, perfectly timed, like a confession turned into frequency. Álvaro Quintero could no longer tell where his pulse ended and the monasteries began. He sat at the center of the chapel, lantern extinguished, listening as the vibration thickened into layers. Low hum beneath his ribs, higher hiss brushing the top of his skull. It wasn't language anymore. It was structure, a sonic geometry mapped over silence. He had tried to leave hours earlier. The door to the courtyard refused to open, not locked, but sealed by crystallization. The hinges fused silently before his eyes, threads of salt twisting across metal like veins under skin. He struck it with a hammer, but the blow only deepened the sound, as if the building absorbed it, memorized it, returned it slower. When he finally gave up, the realization settled cold. He wasn't trapped by walls, but by sound. The monastery had closed itself around him like a lung. He wrote one final note in his journal, his handwriting shaky, letters bleeding at the edges where humidity gathered. The salt vibrates with purpose. It remembers structure, pattern, and guilt. The mountain is listening. He pressed the page flat to dry, but droplets began forming over the ink before his eyes. Each one swelled, merged with the next, until the surface of the paper shimmered like skin under sweat. Then, slowly, the ink rearranged itself. The words shifted into alignment with invisible symmetry, crossing over his own like veins, forming a new circulatory system. "You are part of it now." He dropped the journal, heart pounding. The sound of it hitting the floor resonated deeper than it should have, echoing up through his knees. The rhythm had changed again, closer now, more deliberate. The bell rang once. The sound rolled through the stones in a slow cascade. From every wall, thin lines of condensation began to form again, dripping rhythmically to the floor. The droplets were no longer clear. They were faintly red. Rust or blood. He couldn't tell. They hit the salt, hissed softly, and were absorbed. He followed the sound to the base of the bell tower. The spiral stairs that once crumbled away were no longer impassable. The gaps between them filled overnight with hardened white formations, like ribs repairing themselves. Against his own reason, he climbed. Halfway up, he stopped. The air grew colder, wetter, the light dimmer with each turn. His breath left thin trails that didn't vanish. They hung suspended, drawn slowly toward the walls where they condensed into new veins of salt. By the time he reached the upper chamber, his lantern had gone out. The moonlight entered only through a small slit at the tower's edge, diffused by mist. Inside, the bell hung motionless, massive and white, not bronze, not iron, completely encrusted with salt. Yet somehow it moved. With every slow exhale, the surface trembled, releasing a faint dust that sparkled in the dark. It was as though the bell itself was breathing. He approached carefully, footsteps crunching over a film of crystals. The hum around him intensified, weaving patterns that pulsed through the air. He could see them, literal distortions, ripples folding the space between him and the bell like water disturbed by sound. He whispered, "Who rings it?" The answer came not through echo, but through air pressure. A pulse hit his chest so forcefully that he staggered. The bell moved slightly, its rope, long rotted away, now replaced by a column of solidified salt. It swayed once, barely, yet the movement carried the sound of 1,000 choral voices collapsing into one. The vibration built rapidly, filling his lungs until his breath synchronized involuntarily. The pitch rose higher, sharper, unbearable, and in that single harmonic instant, the salt covering the bell fractured. Light poured from the cracks, dim, colorless, the radiance of compression, not illumination. And with it came the sound, neither music nor scream, but a frequency so pure it erased all others. His vision blurred. The edges of the room bent inward. He saw the statues below, the monks of salt, shift in the periphery of his mind. Their forms softened, arms uncurling slightly, mouths opening for the first time. But no words came, only the vibration. He fell to his knees, hands pressed over his ears, though it did nothing. The sound wasn't entering through hearing. It was being remembered directly by the body. He felt it mapping his skeleton, tracing the spaces between his ribs, resonating in every cavity. Then it stopped. The silence afterward was not relief. It was displacement. He could hear his own heartbeat, but slower, thicker, as if submerged. The bell no longer moved, but something else had awakened below. From the depths of the monastery, far beneath the sealed reliquary chamber, came a new sound, a deep inhale, enormous, patient, and old. The air shifted direction. The fog outside began to draw inward through the cracks, sucked into the building as though the mountain itself had taken breath for the first time in centuries. The pressure dropped. Every flame in the monastery extinguished in unison. Then, from the darkness at the bottom of the tower, he heard footsteps. Not echoing, absorbed by the salt. Slow, deliberate, perfectly even. He turned, lantern dead, eyes adjusting to the pale shimmer that rose from the walls. The light wasn't from fire, it was from condensation refracting on crystal. The steps stopped just below him. A shadow, no form, no outline, only absence, waited at the base of the stairs. And then, as if the whole monastery exhaled, the voice returned. Not from stone, from inside him. "Say it." He wanted to speak, but no air came. His throat constricted, tongue dry as dust. The pressure grew unbearable, tears forming against his will, stinging his cheeks as they crystallized into salt upon contact. The whisper deepened, now shaped like words. What you write, I remember. What you hide, I keep. He tried to deny it, but his hands betrayed him, writing on their own, tracing letters in the dust at his feet. He watched, horrified, as his own trembling fingers spelled, mea culpa. The bell did not ring again. It sighed. And as it did, the salt walls began to glow, softly, like 1,000 veins illuminated from within. From the courtyard below, those who had climbed from the village saw the monastery blaze white for a heartbeat, then go dark again. When they reached it hours later, they found the door sealed, and inside, only silence, dense, mineral, and breathing. When the villagers forced the door at dawn, it did not open. It yielded. The hinges had fused into the wall like bone, and the wood itself was no longer wood. Every surface shimmered under a translucent skin of mineral that flexed faintly when touched. It was warm. They recoiled instinctively, crossing themselves, muttering that the mountain had taken what was owed. Inside, the air was thick as brine. Each breath stung the throat. Salt hung in suspension, glinting like dust in a shaft of light that pierced through a broken tile in the roof. The sound of dripping filled the silence. Steady, patient, like an organ still alive. They found Quintero's lantern first, half embedded in the floor. Its handle was encased in a sheath of crystalline growth, curved around it like a hand. The notebook lay beside it, soaked but intact, every page stiff with mineral residue. The writing had continued far beyond his last known entry. Yet the ink was not ink. It was a faint gray line of condensed salt, letters extruded rather than drawn. The words were shaky, uneven, but legible. It remembers me. The salt repeats what we do not say. It is writing with my blood. Past that, the handwriting changed. It became rounder, more deliberate, too symmetrical to be human. Each letter aligned perfectly to the last, as if written by a mechanism rather than a hand. The final line simply read, "The body confesses itself." They did not find his body. At the center of the chapel, where the altar had stood, the salt had risen into a new shape. Tall, uneven, almost organic. At first glance, it seemed like a stalagmite, but under closer light, they saw that it contained a core of something dark, fibrous, and still damp. The edges pulsed faintly with moisture. When touched, the structure gave off a low vibration, identical to the one villagers remembered from beneath their feet whenever the bell had rung. They said it felt like a heartbeat, but slower, older. Near the base, beneath a thin crust, they found fragments of fabric, brown wool, clerical, twisted and preserved in crystalline veins. No face, no bone, only the suggestion of a spine, elongated into mineral. By afternoon, the priest from the valley arrived with a small delegation. They sealed the place again, pronounced it unholy, and forbade further visitation. But the rumor spread anyway, that the monastery had been forgiven by the mountain, that it had confessed through the man who dared to listen. Weeks later, one of the villagers, a mason named Correa, was sent to reinforce the lower walls. When he broke through a layer of salt behind the altar, he found something that shouldn't have been there. A cavity filled with standing water, perfectly still, clear as glass. Floating just beneath the surface were words traced in residue. They changed when viewed from different angles, like reflections shifting under pressure. He swore they said, "Ad confessionem perpetuam," the same phrase carved into the reliquary chamber below. He sealed the hole immediately and told no one, but that night he woke to the sound of dripping from his roof. When he went to look, he found salt forming along the beams. First in lines, then in circles, then in patterns identical to fingerprints. His own. By the following morning, his tools had rusted. His wife said the house smelled like the monastery, like iron and stone after rain. Word reached Bogota eventually. The diocese ordered an inspection, dispatching a young geologist and an archivist to record the site. Their reports still exist, though few have read them. One describes the phenomenon in clinical detail: capillary moisture migration, crystallization kinetics, acoustic anomalies consistent with resonance cavities. The other begins as documentation and ends as prayer. Both note the same impossible event. At exactly noon, during measurement of barometric pressure, the temperature dropped by 8 degrees. All instruments failed. Then the bell, which had been removed months before, rang once. Not from the tower, from beneath the floor. The sound vibrated for 11 seconds, during which all saline deposits on the walls briefly liquefied, forming droplets that ran downward, pooling near the altar. The investigators noted that the liquid carried suspended organic fibers and microscopic iron traces, both consistent with blood. When the sample dried, it left behind a crystalline lattice shaped like handwriting. They sent it to Bogotá for analysis. The lab report classified it as complex halite growth with unknown pattern symmetry. But when the photograph was developed, faint letters could be read along the top edge of the slide. Mea culpa. No one could explain how the words had appeared. The monastery remains sealed. The valley around it is barren now, the soil leached of life by salt carried downhill with each storm. When rain falls, the runoff collects in shallow basins that shimmer under moonlight. Smooth, white, almost reflective. Those who live nearby avoid looking too long. They say the surface moves when you breathe near it, as if mirroring your chest. Every year, on the anniversary of the last bell, mist descends early and stays through dawn. The villagers claim that if you stand near the base of the mountain and whisper a sin you've never confessed, the echo doesn't return. It stays up there. And sometimes, when the air is right, you can hear it answer. A single word carried through the fog. Forgiven. But no one ever says it twice. For months after the sealing of San Laureano, the valley below changed in ways no one could measure but everyone could feel. The air, once thick with the scent of clay and wet pine, turned metallic, faintly sweet, like the aftertaste of tears. The crops yellowed too early. Water from the wells tasted brackish no matter how deep they were dug. The villagers began carrying rosaries again, not from devotion but fear of silence. Every dawn, a thin mist crept down from the mountain. It dissolved by noon, but left behind a fine white residue on the roofs, light enough to be mistaken for ash. Children drew on it with their fingers. Within minutes, the marks hardened, perfect replicas fossilized into the tiles. No rain washed them away. They said the mountain was still confessing. At first, the church denied any connection. Official statements from Bogotá called it a geological anomaly, evaporate bloom caused by subterranean mineral expansion. But privately, a few letters circulated among the clergy. They warned of transmitted resonance, spiritual infection, and memory preserved in salt. Some priests refused to bless water from the region, claiming it spoke when held in stillness. In the evenings, the older men gathered outside the cantina and told stories about Álvaro Quintero. Some said he'd been swallowed by the mountain. Others claimed he'd become part of the monastery itself, his breath trapped forever inside its walls. They said that if you put your ear to a stone from its ruins, you could hear the faint scratching of a pen. One night in late October, a shepherd named Iriarte returned from the slopes pale as bone. His flock had refused to pass a certain ridge where the fog seemed thicker. He swore he'd heard the bell again. Once, faint, deep. When he turned, all 30 sheep were standing still, heads bowed toward the mountain. None moved until he spoke their names. Within days, the rumor reached the towns downstream. People began arriving with bottles and jars, collecting residue from the foot of the slope, believing it to be sacred. They called it sal de confesión. Merchants sold it in markets wrapped in linen, claiming a pinch under the tongue could erase the weight of guilt. For a time, it seemed to work. Those who used it described vivid dreams, corridors of stone, the hum of air under pressure, whispers that repeated their thoughts a half-second late. A few said they woke with salt on their lips, as if they'd wept in their sleep. But then the voices began. They started faint, only when the world was still. People claimed they could hear their own sins returned to them, altered by distance, softened by echo. One woman, a seamstress named Lucia, stopped speaking entirely after hearing her dead husband's confession in her own voice. Another, a child barely 8, began writing Latin prayers she'd never been taught. By December, the diocese sent emissaries again. Not scientists this time, but exorcists. They climbed to San Laureano with relics, incense, and sacramental oil. They did not descend for 3 days. When they finally emerged, they carried no relics back. only sealed jars filled with the monastery's salt, marked with the same triangle and circle sigil of St. Aurelius. They never spoke of what they saw, but one of them, Father Ocampo, left a single note inside his breviary before vanishing from the parish months later. It read, "We tried to absolve the stone. It listened. Then it answered." The church forbade further pilgrimages. A fence was raised, though no one needed convincing. The ground near the path began to crack open with pale fissures, the earth itself crystallizing along fault lines that glowed faintly at night. Some said they could see movement inside the cracks, like veins pulsing under translucent skin. By the second year, no birds nested near the slope. Animals avoided it entirely. During storms, lightning struck only the monastery's peak, never twice in the same place. Yet each strike left the same afterglow, white, steady, silent. In Bogotá, the surviving records from Quintero's expedition were sealed in the Archivo Nacional under Anomalías Físico-Eclesiásticas, 1913. Access was restricted. The few photographs that leaked decades later showed nothing extraordinary. A man's shadow against a wall, a bell tower swallowed by mist. But those who handled the originals reported an odd phenomenon, fingerprints appearing on the negatives, white and grainy, though no one had touched them. At night, under magnification, the prints seemed to move. Scholars dismissed it as chemical degradation. The archivists learned to store them facing away from one another, separated by paper. They said that if two were left touching overnight, a faint outline appeared between them, the silhouette of a man kneeling. When asked who it was, one of the archivists answered softly, almost to himself, "The one who listened too long." The rest kept quiet. And still, once a year, when the mists descend and the air tastes of iron, the bell rings again. Not loudly, not always heard, just enough for the bones to feel it. By 1952, almost 40 years after the events at San Laureano, the monastery had become a legend more than a place. Maps no longer marked its location. The path that once wound up the slope had collapsed in two separate landslides, and the valley beneath had turned to barren flats of white dust. Locals called it El Valle de los Suspiros, the Valley of Whispers. From time to time, expeditions attempted to reach the ruins again. Scientists, journalists, even poets. Most returned with the same expression, a sort of stillness behind the eyes, as though the place had taught them to listen too carefully. Others never came back. Those who did spoke of phenomena impossible to capture in measurement. Compasses spinning without magnetism, barometers pulsing in time with the heart, voices recorded on silent film. In one recovered reel, dated 1949, a man in a long coat stands before what appears to be the monastery's facade. The image flickers, grainy and overexposed. Behind him, fog moves upward instead of across. He says nothing for 3 minutes, just breathes, slow, uneven. And then, as the reel ends, the salt crust on the wall behind him begins to crumble in rhythmic pulses, spelling out a single word before the frame burns out. Recordare. Remember. No official explanation survived the censorship that followed. The Colombian Geological Society labeled it a hoax. The church issued silence. Yet the villagers, now older and fewer, still refused to build near the mountain. "You can't live under something that breathes," they said. "Sooner or later, it exhales." The belief persisted that the monastery's salt could store voices, that it held the resonance of all who had entered. Around the 1960s, a team of physicists from Medellin set up acoustic instruments near the old riverbed to test this claim. They transmitted controlled frequencies through the ground, recording the echoes that returned. The results were never published. One technician, a young woman named Mariela Ortiz, later wrote privately that at 47 Hz, a frequency lower than human hearing, the microphones began to pick up what she called involuntary responses, words half-formed in breath. She insisted that the recordings were not echoes of their own transmissions but something preceding them, sound waves arriving before they were sent. She described the last night of the experiment. "We played back the recording, and we heard our own voices asking questions we hadn't spoken yet." The project was shut down. Decades later, in 1981, an earthquake struck the region. Minor tremor by most standards, yet it caused the entire hillside to split open, revealing a section of the old monastery's crypt. The first rescue team reported a cavity filled not with debris, but with standing water. Clear, unmoving, luminescent under flashlight. When they tried to wade through it, the surface hardened beneath their boots, transforming to salt mid-step. Inside the cavity walls, there were etchings, some fresh, others ancient. One investigator copied a phrase before the fissure closed under its own weight. A confession must continue until it forgets who speaks. He never returned to the site. By the early 1990s, satellite imaging captured unusual light patterns across the region. On dry seasons, when mist cleared, reflective surfaces appeared on the mountain slopes. Smooth, mirror-like planes that registered temperature differentials as if they were alive. Scientists dismissed it as mineral reflection. Locals said the mountain had opened its eyes. In Bogota, a graduate student rediscovered Quintero's notebook among restricted archives. The paper had hardened to near stone, yet the words were perfectly preserved, each stroke crystalline. Under ultraviolet light, the text emitted faint luminescence. Pulsing at regular intervals, 72 times per minute, the rhythm of a resting human heart. One phrase appeared that was never recorded in his known writings. The mountain remembers in salt what men forget in prayer. Soon after the discovery, the notebook vanished from the archive. The guard on duty reported nothing unusual, only that the shelf where it had rested was covered in a thin layer of dust that tasted like the sea. The church reinstated its silence. The scientists moved on to new projects. But the mountain remained, and once in a while, during certain seasons, hikers on the opposite ridge reported hearing something faint and regular beneath the wind. Not a voice, not music, just a vibration too deliberate to be natural, deep enough to feel in the chest before the ear. It came and went like breath. Those who stayed longer described sensations impossible to articulate. Warmth rising through stone, metallic taste on the tongue, the distinct impression of being observed from inside the mountain itself. In 1997, a team of engineers surveying groundwater in the region found that the entire valley resonated at 47 Hz, the same frequency noted in Mariela Ortiz's report half a century earlier. When one of them jokingly whistled into a fissure, a delayed echo returned. It wasn't his tone. It was lower, slower, and distinctly shaped like a word. Listen, they sealed the fissure with concrete that same day. But the next morning, salt began to bloom through the surface. Thin white veins tracing upward, spelling nothing coherent, only the outline of fingerprints. They covered it again. And every year since, during the first week of June, the same fissure opens, weeps brine, and seals itself by dawn. No one touches it now. The villagers just bow their heads when the mist descends and whisper into their hands, as if returning what the mountain lent them. There are no maps that name San Laureano anymore. Only the silence that hovers over its coordinates, the kind of silence that feels weighted, shaped by what was once spoken inside it. The valley lies quiet under an eternal film of white, its soil turned brittle, its rivers tasting faintly of metal and prayer. When the wind moves, it does not whistle. It hums, low and continuous, like the tail end of a confession that never ended. Locals say the mountain dreams in salt. They say at night, if you stand on the southern ridge, you can see the surface of the slope glisten with a pale phosphorescence, pulsing in slow intervals, a rhythm too regular to belong to nature. Some call it the monastery's breath, others the mountain's forgiveness. No one remembers Alvaro Quintero as a heretic or a saint. His name survives only in the brittle paper of old reports, misfiled among geological surveys and ecclesiastical decrees. Yet even those who have never read his story seem to carry its residue. The entire valley behaves like a memory half-dreamt, repeating gestures it cannot understand, confessing without a voice. During the long dry seasons, when no mist remains and the sun burns away every shadow, the salt on the ground begins to crack. The fissures align themselves along invisible axes, forming patterns that resemble writing. Each summer, it writes something new. Each year, the same hand. In 2003, a surveyor photographing erosion patterns noticed that from high above, when viewed at the right angle of dusk, the valley's surface formed the outline of a human figure kneeling. Its proportions matched the dimensions of the monastery chapel. He didn't publish the image. The negatives dissolved 2 days later, covered in translucent bloom. Only the smell of iron and damp paper remained. The locals weren't surprised. It wants to remember what it looked like, they said, before it turned to stone. And still, they avoid the mountain. They live in its shadow, build their houses facing away from it, hang mirrors above their doors so that whatever listens from the slope will see only its own reflection. When asked why, they answer softly, because it listens back. Sometimes the younger ones dare to climb halfway, bringing offerings of water or coins. They say the silence grows thicker the higher you go, as if pressing against the skin. Some have described faint impressions in the ground, footprints that match no one's stride, forming perfect circles that lead nowhere. They return home pale, lips dry, and when they sleep, they dream of walls sweating salt, of air too heavy to breathe, of a voice whispering beneath their ribs. Say it again. Most wake before dawn, trembling. Some wake with white residue on their palms. There are no ceremonies for the mountain now, no bells, no prayers. Only the quiet exchange between air and stone, between what is remembered and what is confessed. And still, the mountain waits. Every few years, someone disappears. A traveler, a shepherd, an amateur historian, drawn by curiosity or faith. The valley accepts them gently, leaves no trace but a single sound carried on mist. A deep inhalation, followed by nothing. Yet for those who remain, when storms crawl in from the lowlands and thunder rolls across the ridge, they swear they can hear it again, faint but certain, the slow tolling of a bell that no longer exists. Each vibration soft, deliberate, hollowed by time. Each echo fading into the soil like breath returning to lungs. And beneath it all, a single whisper threaded through the air, familiar now as heartbeat. It prays without voice, but the walls remember every word. It begins again with the taste. Every few decades, when the fog descends too early and the river slows to stillness, the air in the valley turns bitter, the faint tang of salt carried on wind that moves without sound. No one calls it a miracle anymore. It's older than miracles, quieter than faith. It happens when the mountain exhales. The first to notice are always the children. They wake before dawn, saying the walls are breathing, that the windows hum. Their mothers hush them, telling stories of rain that hasn't yet come. But by morning, white dust will have gathered along the sills, fine as snow, warm to the touch. It grows thicker through the day. Roofs glisten, wells brine, and the sound begins. Too low to hear, too close to ignore. A pulse underfoot, steady and patient, the mountain remembering itself. The villagers no longer climb to the ruins. The path is gone now, collapsed into terraces of salt and clay. Yet sometimes, from the right distance, when the mist lifts just enough to reveal the slope, they can see what looks like movement. Not shadows, not people, only the brief illusion of something kneeling, rising, then still again. At dusk, the light bends strangely. The whole valley becomes translucent, as though viewed through water. The outlines of the old monastery appear for an instant, arches of air and memory, bell tower suspended in fog. Then it's gone, leaving only the hum. No one dares speak during that hour. Words travel differently there. They don't return as they should. Say your name aloud, and the echo comes back slower, changed. Say a prayer, and silence answers, heavy and kind. The old say the mountain learned to pray for those who forgot how. In time, even the river adapted. Its current carries fine particles of mineral down to the plains, where farmers complain their wells taste of iron. But in moonlight, that same water glows faintly. Not reflection, but emission. Samples taken under laboratory light reveal microscopic structures repeating in impossible order, each identical to human fingerprints. When researchers attempt to catalog them, the files corrupt. The data folds in on itself, numbers repeating recursively, equations writing their own names. They stop trying. They seal the samples. They move on. And yet, the salt grows. No one sees it forming. It simply appears. On windows, along fences, inside lungs. A miner in Tunja once coughed up a crystal perfect as glass. He said it whispered when he held it near his ear. At night, the same hum returns, rolling through the ground like distant thunder stretched across hours. It passes beneath villages, beneath rivers, beneath sleep. Dogs wake and stare toward the mountain, trembling but silent. Infants smile in their cradles. Old men weep without knowing why. Once a year, on the anniversary of the bell, the wind stops entirely. The valley stands suspended, neither day nor night, only that pale diffused glow that seems to come from within the fog itself. If you stand near the base of the slope and listen, the sound deepens. Not loud, but encompassing, like being spoken through. Some say it's the voice of God. Others say it's the earth remembering. And if you stay long enough, if you resist the urge to run, the vibration begins to match your own pulse. You feel it under your skin, gentle at first, then insistent, your heartbeat slowing to meet it. Breath by breath, the distance collapses. The air tastes of iron. The ground is warm. And in that warmth, something moves. A single droplet forms on stone, runs downward, leaves a trail of salt. Then another and another, until the wall itself begins to glisten, weeping silently in the half-light. The air thickens, turns briny, alive. If you touch it, it clings to your skin. If you speak, it listens. And when you fall silent, it answers. Not in words, but in rhythm. The same slow pulse that began a century ago, when a man named Alvaro Quintero walked into the fog and never returned. The same pulse that waits now beneath your feet, counting the seconds between breaths, between heartbeats, between sins remembered and forgotten. The same pulse that will continue long after names and prayers dissolve. For the mountain does not forgive, it records. And somewhere beneath the salt, it still breathes.